And again, good morning and welcome to our Monday morning lecture series. Our speaker today is Dr. Jeremy Campbell, and his subject is, for all of us, the Indigenous struggle for life and land in Amazonia. I ask that you please stay muted through the class unless you have a question to ask. If you have a question, you may either type it into the chat or raise your hand and wait to be recognized. We generally take live questions at the end of the lecture. The live transcript has been turned on for those of you who need or want subtitles. If you want to turn them off, click on live transcript, hide subtitles. So once again, this is the Monday morning lecture series. And our speaker is Dr. Jeremy Campbell, and he is the president of the Society for the Anthropology of Lowland South America and Director of Strategic Engagement at George Mason University Institute for the Sustainable Earth. An award-winning author, he has 2 decades of experience conducting anthropologic and community action research in the Brazilian Amazon. And good morning, Dr. Campbell.
Good morning, Meg. Thank you very much for that warm introduction. Good morning, all. I'm so happy to be here with Ollie as part of the Monday morning lecture series. And yeah, as Meg indicated, and as you all can see, hopefully on the Zoom screen, the focus of my talk today, our time together, is going to be on something that I've been studying for the past 2+ decades, really, which is the Indigenous struggle for land rights, for recognition, for territorial sovereignty in Amazonia, which is a broad term that describes the basin of the Amazon River, which is not exclusive to the Amazon River. It actually has 6 of the world's 10 largest rivers by water flow, by water output. It's an amazing biodiverse region, obviously, in the northern half of South America. And so, as Meg indicated, my focus of my research has been in the Brazilian Amazon, and that's where I'll take you today, but many of the themes about habitat destruction, violation of indigenous rights are not unique to the Brazilian context. Brazil covers roughly 65% of the Amazon basin, but 8 other sovereign nation states have a slice of Amazonia, as it were, and these issues of deforestation, land dispossession, and the indigenous response to that. You can see that in Peru, you can see it in Ecuador, you can see it in Venezuela, Guyana, Bolivia, etc. And so hopefully we'll go, I'm an anthropologist by training, right? So we'll go to the very specific, but we'll also come back out to some generalizable sorts of themes and maybe even lessons, takeaways from the time that I've spent with Indigenous activists and Indigenous communities, takeaways that we can apply to our own lives and how we see the world. And so once again, I want to thank you all for making the time to join me today. And we will have time for questions, certainly at the end. And if there's anything technical that comes along, don't be shy to raise your hand or put something in the chat. If I'm going too quickly, hopefully I won't, because I really do want to give time to explore and sort of expand upon some of these interesting things that I've learned, that I've had the privilege to learn over the past 2 decades of working in Brazil. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So I want to start today by giving the floor, as it were, to one of my dear friends and collaborators, an Indigenous leader named Alessandra Corapi, whom I've known for the past 10 years or so. She was the recipient last year of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award, for which she was flown to Washington, D.C. And received that award because of her sort of fearless leadership as a member of the Munduruku Indigenous nation in the Brazilian Amazon. So this is a quote that my friend Alessandra shared with me last year, actually, while I was doing field work in Brazil. She says, "Our struggle is for survival, for life, for the forest, and for our children. So we will resist. In spite of all the attacks from the government, we are resisting and we will continue to resist." And then she paused and said, "We do this for all of us, And it's that spirit, it's that quote that I'm borrowing for the title of my talk today, with Alessandra's permission. I asked her as we were conversing about this, what she meant by all of us. Did she mean everyone in her community, everyone in the Munduruku Indigenous Nation, all Indigenous peoples, who? And she went on to say, no, everyone in the world is implicated by what we're doing. Everyone in the world benefits from Brazilians, or Indigenous Amazonians in Brazil and the other countries stepping up to defend their forest. Why? Because of the value, the environmental and ecosystemic value of that forest. That's one big reason, and we'll talk about that. But there are other reasons as well, from a shared humanities perspective, from a how do we relate to the world around us perspective. Alessandra and other Indigenous leaders in the Brazilian Amazon have tremendous courage in stepping into the fray against all odds, against enemies that would take their land, that would dig up the land for the mineral wealth underneath it. So their courage is unquestionable, but they're also incredible sort of exemplars of human generosity, and a shining example for how to relate to one another in a shared humanity, but also how to think about a sort of cultivating goodwill with non-humans as well, plants, animals, the world in which they find themselves, in the world in that they struggle for. And so those are some of the themes that really come out of this struggle that Indigenous leaders like Alessandra have been waging for the past several decades as they look to defend their rights to land, defend their lands themselves. It's an inspiration from which, from which all of us can learn. So I'd like to kind of break down and give you sort of a roadmap of the things that we'll be talking about today thematically. The very first thing is the biggest picture of why specifically Indigenous possession of or management of land matters, and why it really is globally important, why it's for all of us, to use Alessandra's phrasing. And for that, we'll have to understand a little bit of the ecology, a little bit of meteorology and climatology as well. Not my areas of expertise, but because I work in a particular part of the world that's important in the global ecosystem, I know a thing or two about it. Second matter that we'll focus on is the current threat specifically in Brazil. It has echoes in other Amazonian countries, but the specific threat in Brazil is dire due to the political and economic situation there today. And it's what I'm terming the anti-Indigenous package of law, of policies that really are targeting Indigenous possession of land, and why that matters, again, to all of us. And then the third thing that we'll focus on, if my slide can advance now, is what's at stake for Indigenous Amazonians. So Alessandra and her community on the Tapajós River, one of the main tributaries of the Amazon River, what's at stake for them? Certainly they understand the global importance of the Amazon, what we'll be talking about in number one here. But the region that they inhabit, and the very specific tributary or area that the Munduruku, for example, inhabit, is an entire world. And that world is replete with cosmological, religious, spiritual, and very material significance for Indigenous communities as well. And so it's a way of being in and literally making the world that Indigenous Amazonians practice on a daily basis in relationship to non-human actors, plants, animals, spirits, etc. So we'll uncrack that a little bit and get sort of an anthropological assessment of what's at stake for Indigenous Amazonians as they defend an ecosystem, a habitat that has global importance, but also has very special, specific, and local importance for them. A little bit more about me and how I come to this work. I began my career as an anthropologist a little over 20 years ago, living and working in the Brazilian Amazon. And at first, I was very interested in sort of the colonial push into the Amazon, how migrants from other parts of Brazil and indeed from other parts of the world, including some American farmers, a very small community, but some folks who were born in Iowa have resettled in the sort of what's called the agricultural frontier of Brazil, which is every year pushing further and further into the Amazon. And so I studied that process, wrote a book about that process, specifically on how public lands within the Amazon were turned into private property. And you'll see sort of echoes of that theme in the material that I'm going to be sharing with you today. But for the past 8 years or so, I've been looking at the other side of the coin, which is through partnership with Indigenous and other traditional communities, I've tried to sort of understand, again, what's at stake for them as they confront land dispossession, as they confront new policies coming out of Brasilia and other capitals, also state capitals, that make it harder for Indigenous peoples to be recognized and afforded their constitutional and their human rights. I've done that from a research perspective, but I've also been engaged doing community level work. I've done quite a bit of English language translation of public statements that Indigenous groups have written to sort of tell the world about their struggle. They're very savvy, as we'll explore, with communications, with public relations, with forging and maintaining alliances with global communities, global organizations, et cetera. So I've played a role in that by helping connect Indigenous Brazilians to other organizations, but also serving as a kind of mouthpiece in the Anglophone world for their public statements. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we get into it. Grillaging is an interesting phenomenon. It's worth maybe an hour's lecture on its own, but that's not the topic today. It's instead sort of the context. The best way to translate this word from Portuguese, grillaging, is land grabbing. And it's land grabbing that is usually done through subterfuge, usually done with some appearance of legality, of officialdom, through the forging of papers or through well-oiled sort of legal or political maneuvers, tricks essentially to turn public lands. And the vast majority of Brazil's Amazonia regions are public lands. They're either managed as conservation units, or they are demarcated as indigenous territories, or they're simply public lands available for homesteading. And homesteading is permitted by law, but often people begin to homestead and take more land through various tricks and legal maneuvers than they actually are entitled to. And so that process, you can imagine, over the past 4 or 5 decades, has resulted in many people coming into the Amazon, claiming lands, subdividing those lands, selling them off, and that's put an incredible amount of pressure on Indigenous and other traditional communities in the region. So in response to that, the Munduruku, with whom I work, but also other Indigenous people, we'll talk about sort of the scale of this a little bit later, have responded to land grabbing, have responded to grillaging by demarcating their own territories. And so that's what this map, especially the big map on the right, sort of indicates. This is placing us in the world. The 2 shaded areas are areas that have been under traditional cultivation, have been under traditional management for many years. And they are threatened by land grabbing, which comes up through this highway. Hopefully you can see my pointer. Actually, I'll make it so that you can see my pointer. This highway here, many colonists come up through this highway and then create side roads, cut themselves, not official roads, in order to gain access to land, to set up ranches, or to begin to cut valuable hardwoods, and then set up ranches, and then perhaps sell off the territory to a third party. Some mining also happens in this region. So in the face of that, the Munduruku have demarcated this area called Saide Mobu, and other traditional settlers who are non-Indigenous have demarcated this area. We won't say too much about them, but this tactic of demarcating your own territory in the face of private citizens who want to take it from you is happening because the state, the Brazilian government, has been absent in this region, has been derelict in its duties of defending constitutionally mandated rights that Indigenous people enjoy, and also human rights. So this is a very dangerous area. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the violence that's perpetrated by land grabbers against Indigenous leaders. But this essential dynamic of standing up, not being cowed by the power structure, is the thing that we're kind of unpacking. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of where we are, and we'll add more details as we move through. So the first of the three things that we're going to focus on: why does Indigenous possession of land even matter, right? What are some of maybe the global implications of Indigenous possession of and management of land? And this is really beyond the Amazon as well. But if we take a look specifically at the Amazon case, I'm sure we're all aware of the fact that this biome, this ecosystem, is under enormous pressure. And over the past 50 years, approximately 20% of the forest has been converted to pasture. So it's been cut down, it's been converted to pasture. Many of those pastures have also been abandoned because of economic volatility. And we know now, because the science is clear, that the forest doesn't simply bounce back. What's happening is that it's drying out, and land that has been converted to pasture also then converts, when it's left fallow, to savanna, which is grassland, essentially. So the entire Amazon ecosystem is under pressure, and it's being pushed. The climatologists and meteorologists have shown us decisively that we're dangerously close to a tipping point, past which the forest will actually begin to convert naturally to savanna. Why? Because the region is drying out. The region has a water cycle, a hydrological cycle that is self-sustaining, and that shares water with other regions outside the Amazon. But with more trees being cut down, more fires being set, we're actually close to a negative feedback cycle whereby more and more trees will be lost, even if humans aren't actually chopping them down. And there's 390 billion trees, which obviously has implications for the global carbon balance, which is so important with the climate crisis. However, there's a bright spot, which is that where Indigenous control of land is assured, where it is legally guaranteed and protected, there the forest is standing, right? And this is a fact that is not unique to the Amazon. We see this in sub-Saharan Africa. We see this in North America. We see this in Mesoamerica. We see this in Australia. Traditional ecological management is good for local environments. So where Indigenous tenure is assured, the forest is standing. This actually makes, and climate scientists make this point, but also intergovernmental agencies make the point, that recognizing and supporting Indigenous rights to land is actually one of the most cost-effective climate change mitigation strategies that we have. Think about it for a second. It essentially costs nothing to recognize Indigenous tenure, right? You have to defend it, perhaps you have to police it, you have to come up with some kind of management strategy, but it's far, far, far cheaper than scrubbing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that we've already put into the atmosphere by investing billions or even trillions of dollars in unproven technology. Where we should work on that front, because we should certainly not look astray at any innovation. But some of the more far-fetched geoengineering ideas of seeding clouds so that sunlight gets reflected from the earth, those are very expensive and not guaranteed to work. Whereas Indigenous tenure and control over territory would actually keep a lot of carbon in the ground, and even reforestation or afforestation could happen to bring carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back into trees. So this is a very important takeaway that Indigenous possession of land actually helps the global climate and global meteorological system. To to bring us into the ecosystem, again, northern South America, this image is showing, as the red appears, this is area that has been deforested over the past 50 years. So the green area is still standing forest, still healthy, but highly stressed ecosystems. And the bright green area, or I should say the dark green area, is the Brazilian portion of the Amazon. But again, we have Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador as well, which is to the west here and not on this map, share part of the Amazon biome as well. This next map focuses in on the Brazilian portion of the Amazon, and the tail here is what I said just a moment ago, that indigenous possession of land really is a brake on deforestation and habitat transformation. So the dark green and the light green areas are indigenous territories and conservation units. And you'll see that they all are standing and doing pretty well. These red areas are the deforested areas. You see this arc of deforestation, which every year is moving a little bit deeper, a little bit deeper. The worrisome areas, from my perspective, and from, I would argue, should be worrisome to all people, are orange areas, which are no man's land, essentially. These are not within protected areas. They're not within indigenous territories. They are open for privatization. They're open for land grabbing. The dark red areas as well. These are areas which, according to this map, are without information. That's what it says in Portuguese. So remember, as I was saying before about the tipping point, if we can imagine all of the orange and red areas being converted, that there's forest there now, but if all that gets converted to pasture or gets deforested, the Amazon as a whole, not just the Brazilian area, but all of the biome, all the basin, will be on the path to savanization. So this is a real concern. Whereas if we could imagine those orange and red areas being converted to indigenous territories or protected in some other kind of modality, that would be very, very good for the climate. To understand some of the sort of global importance of the region, one thing that I need to say, if I haven't said already, is that the Amazon is the world's most biodiverse region. There are species being identified by Western science every day, especially insects, plant species. It is the most biodiverse area, which is valuable in its own terms, but it also has potential implications for future technologies, medical technologies, these sorts of things. So the research potential there is incredibly important and really belongs to all of humanity. The hydrological importance of the region is also incredibly important, because what we've found is that the Amazon rainforest acts as an enormous pump. It acts as a pump that absorbs or really kind of calls into it, because of humidity and variation in gradients and temperature. It sucks in water vapor that evaporates off the ocean, what you see in number 1 here. And that then moves west and rains over the forest, but then hits the wall of the Andes, sending all of that water vapor back down south to number 4 on your map, where it falls as rain in one of the most productive agricultural regions on the planet. This is Argentina, Paraguay, southern Brazil, where wheat, corn, soy, cattle are raised and exported throughout the world, exported to Europe, exported increasingly to China. So the agricultural basis of South America's economy, which is so important to feed South Americans, but is increasingly important to feed other people throughout the world, depends upon the Amazon, depends upon there being trees in the Amazon, depends upon a moist subtropical forest ecosystem, which literally features a floating river or an aerial river that flows kind of counter current to the Amazon, again, sucking moist air off the equatorial regions of the Atlantic coast, bringing it west and south then throughout the Amazon or throughout the South American continent. If we have savanna, if we have grassland where the Amazon stands right now, the viability of that pump goes down. The ability of the Amazon to, through transpiration and evaporation, suck moist air into the continent recedes. And that means what you'll have in the southeastern quarter of the continent, again, Paraguay, Uruguay, southern Brazil, Argentina, desertification. You'll get drier, longer summers, and you'll see, if you actually scan out to a global map, this is the same latitude, this area of South America is the same latitude where you see the Namib Desert in Southern Africa, where you see the Great Central Desert in Australia. So this area, just climatologically in terms of latitude, is a dry area in other places throughout the world. The reason it's not dry here, the reason it's agriculturally productive, is the Amazon rainforest. So that is a globally important feature of this ecosystem. And of course, the science is very, very clear on this. Carlos Nobre, who's been on the short list for receiving the Nobel Prize, he's a climate scientist at the University of Sao Paulo. Our own Thomas Lovejoy here at George Mason, who, as many of you know, recently passed. They've been sounding the alarm on the Amazon tipping point, how deforestation is leading to radical and irreversible habitat change and ecosystemic change. They've been sounding that alarm for the past 10 years. And in fact, we also know from observational science and carbon measuring in the region that parts of the Amazon have become carbon positive, as opposed to a carbon sunk, taking carbon out of the atmosphere. We've changed the habitat so much that it's actually a net contributor to greenhouse gases. Not the entire ecosystem, the entire basin, but parts of it. Again, because we've changed so much of it with the extractive industries like mining, but also through pasteurization and savannization. Thankfully, the world sort of economic or environmental community is waking up to the fact that Amazon's people, their tribal communities, indigenous leaders are actually well positioned to lead in the fight for global climate justice. And so recently at the World Conservation Congress in last September in Marseille, the entire Congress adopted the Amazonia for Life project or initiative, which has as its goal 80%, protecting 80% of the Amazon's area by 2025 to avert the tipping point. So Gregorio Mirabal is the man who's pictured at the center of your slide. He is the leader of a umbrella organization of indigenous groups called COICA. So it's an international interethnic organization. And it's been COICA's initiative to get Amazonian countries, but also non-Amazonian countries, relatively wealthy countries like the United States, European countries, to help support this goal of protecting 80% of the biome, either through indigenous territories being set up or through parks and other restricted use conservation units being set up. And I think this quote is really telling. This is Gregorio saying that back in September, in the throes of the pandemic, he says that the climate emergency is a symptom of a virus in humanity. That language of virus, I think, is very evocative. It's a virus in humanity. And the new vaccine is called Indigenous territorial governance. In other words, we are the cure, right? Our ability to manage and maintain healthy ecosystems, which we see in our own oral histories, Indigenous oral histories speak to this, but we also see the science-based outcomes, the pro-conservation outcomes of Indigenous territory being held and managed by Indigenous people, right? Which is, if we just pause on that, that's important because we think of our own history in this country of setting up national parks or conservation units. I think we can be justly proud of the idea, as Ken Burns says, right, that national parks were America's great idea. And it's an idea that has been shared with the rest of the world. However, the very first national parks that were set up, Yosemite, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, et cetera, were set up through the notion that they needed to be fortresses of conservation, untouched by humans, right? Unmanaged by people who live there. And that resulted in the evictions of the Miwok people, of the Utes and the Shoshone from Yellowstone, right? So the notion that we have of kind of a managed environment, managed by the state or managed by experts, is a little at odds with the idea of indigenous people managing. And it's taken about 150 years of conservation science for the majority of conservation biologists to now recognize, oh, indigenous managerial practices are actually really healthy for a living ecosystem, and putting them front and center in partnership with conservation science is now the best practice. So to sum up this first section, indigenous management of lands is incredibly important globally. And as it said there, right, indigenous title, ownership, possession of land is crucial in the fight for climate justice and sustainability. If we take a global tally, there's roughly 456 million indigenous people throughout the world. And you see in the image, the map on the right, the purple areas are areas that are under indigenous management. So you see a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, much of Siberia, right? Much of the northern portion of the Indian subcontinent and the central part of the Australian continent. 456 million people managing roughly 30% of the world's terrestrial surface, but who only have legal possession of 8%. Now that could be outright ownership, or it could be through reservation setup or land held in trust, which is the case with the United States. Reservations are held in trust by the federal government for indigenous tribes. 30% of the world's ecosystem, terrestrial ecosystem, is managed in sustainable ways. Sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. Hopefully everyone can mute, please. Thank you. But only 8% of it is actually legally protected. So there's a big change, right? Or big difference between 8% and 30%. And in the midst lies a potential, in that difference between 8% being protected forever and 30% being managed right now, that's the difference between a healthy climate, or a climate that can maybe be resilient and bounce back, and one that is set beyond a tipping point in Amazonia, but also in other places as well. So supporting indigenous territorial rights is very important within the Amazon and in other places as well. Now, it's also important within the very specific Brazilian context. And I don't want to sort of belabor this point too much, because we could get off on a tangent that's really fascinating in its own right, which is sort of about Brazilian history. I won't take too long to do that, but one thing that I think is important to point out is that Brazil often models its own sense of itself, its own sense of its history, especially its sense of territorial expansion, on that of the United States, right? So what we have in our history, the idea of manifest destiny, the idea of opening a frontier and pushing that frontier from sea to shining sea, that process also resonates historically in Brazil. We have these the idea of the bandeirantes, who are flag wavers, literally beginning in the 17th century and then through the 20th century, waving flags and dispatching sort of teams of people to settle, civilize, also often steal indigenous people and sell them into slavery as part of a kind of civilizational process of taking European law, European concepts, right, into wild land. Another concept, another way in which this happens in Brazilian history is the idea of the march to the west to really open up new lands. Brazil is the 5th largest country by land in the world. And so many Brazilians who live in the South or who live along the nation's coast where most people live, look to the Amazon as their potential, their destiny, right? A place that needs to be kind of developed because the fortunes of the nation lie there. There's a moment, though, a very important moment in the late 80s, the 1988 Brazilian Constitution, which is a new constitution coming on the heels of 2 decades of dictatorial government within Brazil. And it basically says, wait, we're not going to think of the Amazon as just empty land that's ready for the taking. Instead, we're going to recognize that the Amazon and other parts of Brazil as well, but especially the Amazon, has indigenous groups, some of whom have been contacted and interact with the colonial world, many of whom have not been, and who live in a state of voluntary isolation because they see how damaging Western diseases, violence, et cetera, can be. The 1988 Constitution recognizes the existence of indigenous peoples and recognizes the importance of their connections to their territories. And it actually sets up some very progressive legal ideas and protections for indigenous peoples having claim to their territory. We'll talk more about that in a second. But currently, right now in 2022, there are 700 petitions for land demarcation that are stalled at various stages. Now, what does that mean? Since 1988, the Brazilian government has said, okay, we recognize that indigenous Brazilians have rights to land. We'll set up a process whereby the federal government goes and recognizes those through studies. They send anthropologists, they do historical research, but essentially it's the federal government's responsibility to demarcate and then hold in trust the lands that indigenous peoples have a constitutional right to. The process begins by those communities petitioning for that recognition. And at the current moment, 700 petitions are currently stalled, in part because of the leadership of the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, who has basically promised as part of his campaign a few years ago, not to demarcate any more land for indigenous peoples, because in his view, and in the view of many conservative politicians and agribusiness sort of executives, anyone who claims indigenous identity is lying to try to get something from the state, right? They are false Indians because they're trying to get some kind of advantage from the state, even when there's abundant evidence of indigenous occupation of territory and management of that territory. This is the kind of ideological line that Bolsonaro and his bloc sort of pursues. But it's difficult because, as I said, the 1988 Constitution is an incredibly progressive document. And in part, the conservative backlash today is very much against this provision, the 1988 Brazilian Constitution's provision of recognizing what are called originary rights. Originary is an odd adjective in English, but it's a perfect adjective for what this concept really gets at. So basically, to break it down, the Brazilian Republic, as constituted by the 1988 Constitution, the Brazilian nation state, the government, recognizes that indigenous peoples' inalienable rights to land precede the very establishment of the state. They pre-existed the arrival of the Portuguese in 1500, the establishment of the Brazilian Republic in 1822, the new constitution in 1988. All of that is after the establishment of indigenous rights to land. And so, in other words, the state doesn't give indigenous peoples their rights to land because they already had those rights to land before the state even existed. That's different than what we have in the United States, where an indigenous nation's right to land, a tribal nation's right to land, is predicated on a government-to-government relationship with the United States, sanctified in a treaty, right? And those treaties have a terrible and uneven history, but that's the notion of political sort of recognition between the US government and the governments or representatives of indigenous peoples. And then that relationship begins through a treaty or through a document. In Brazil, the relationship begins when Brazil arrives in the Americas, right? In the 1500s, if you will, right? Because the indigenous peoples and indigenous rights to land precede that. So Brazil is merely recognizing those rights. It isn't giving them. It isn't treatying over them. It's a different kind of relationship, and it's a powerful one. But since it's powerful and since it's progressive, it's inspired some powerful reactions. And not to go too much into detail about this, but the the conservative backlash against the demarcation of indigenous lands has been brewing, has been building for several decades now. And right now it's really at its most powerful because of the work of the president, but also the Congress and other actors. Right now in front of the Supreme Court, a case is working its way to the Supreme Court, which challenges the notion of that Brazil's government merely recognizes indigenous rights, challenges that notion and says, well, those indigenous rights didn't exist a long time ago. Or at least for the relevance of setting up indigenous territories, what matters is, were indigenous peoples in their territory on October 3rd, 1988, which is the day that the Constitution was adopted. This seems reasonable, right? Because you don't want, maybe all of the country to go back to indigenous hands, right? Because 200 million people live there. There's, rule of law, et cetera. So we set it to a date, right? You can only get indigenous demarcated lands if you were in that area on October 3rd, 1988. The problem with that, though, is that so many indigenous peoples were displaced from their traditional homelands due to colonialism prior to 1988, right? And so the Munduruku, the people with whom I work, are demarcating lands that they did not occupy in 1988, but which they had occupied in 1888 and in 1908, right? And which they had memories of and which they have relationships to, but because they were literally fleeing from colonists, fleeing for their lives, were not present in 1988. And so this is part of the kind of political battles, the legal battles that are going on. Other legislation that is threatening indigenous rights, constitutional rights, and human rights include legalizing land invasions. Increasingly over the past 10 years, colonists have gone into demarcated indigenous lands, ones that have already been recognized and set up, and have taken some of that land over and have claimed it for their own, and have had politicians actually, through special acts of Congress, recognize that land and have carved away from the indigenous territory that they grabbed the land from. So this kind of thing is happening. Permitting of mining on indigenous lands without the permission of the indigenous nations is also up for debate within Congress right now too. There's been a counter response. Indigenous peoples are not sort of lying down and taking it. They are organizing on a national and international basis to say, we're here, we've always been here, we have these rights, we're organizing to defend these rights. So these are scenes from some of the protests that have taken place in Brasilia and other major cities in Brazil. Why is this fight happening? Just to be very clear about it. The Brazilian economy over the past generation, really 20 to 30 years, has grown substantially due to export-oriented industries of agriculture and mining. They've become the backbone of Brazil's economy. And agriculture is important throughout Brazil, but it's increasingly dependent on the Amazon for the growth of the sector. And it's an extensive growth model. It's a land-hungry growth model. It is not a growth model that says, okay, I have my 100-acre farm and I'm going to intensify my production so that I get more yield from that acreage. Or I'm going to add value by, instead of selling milk, I'm going to sell organic butter and yogurt, adding value, leading to growth. That's not the model here. The model here is take as much land as you can, convert it, and then once your returns start to diminish, sell it to somebody else and start out again, converting land, et cetera. So it's extensive. It requires or it places pressure on the Amazon landmass, but it has been set up by policy. It's been set up by government incentives to really let the agricultural sector boom in Brazil. But it's a volatile sector, right? When prices go down, that hits your bottom line. When they go up, it hits your bottom line. Mining has also been incredibly important. The world's largest reserves of aluminum, bauxite, aluminum ore are in the Amazon. There's oil, obviously, there are diamonds, there's gold, other things like this. Brazil is a democracy, although it's a flawed democracy, and one of its largest flaws is the incredible entrenched inequality that reflects in the political system. Only 0.4%, so less than half of 1% of the national population owns 22% of the national territory. So that reflects itself in how policies get constructed and implemented. And again, there's this sort of manifest destiny notion in the broader Brazilian kind of public that sees the Amazon as empty, sees it as unoccupied, sees it as needing to be developed, right? So all of this is kind of lining up to put pressure on the territory and especially on Indigenous peoples. This again, the map on the left, the light green shows areas that have been demarcated as traditional inhabited lands, Indigenous lands, again, doing that globally important work of maintaining the water cycle and the carbon cycle, maintaining biodiversity. But you see these areas, these white areas, many of them are open for settlement. And even some of these areas, like this one down here and this one here, have been invaded by farmers saying that's too much land for too few Indigenous people. That's one of the rallying cries of people who want to have land that they feel Indigenous people do not deserve, despite what the 1988 Constitution says. And of course, the logic of colonial property is basically, of land grabbing, is basically to destroy the forest, to set a fire to it. The fires that have been getting larger and larger during the burning season over the past few years, those have mostly been set by ranchers and land grabbers going into public lands, going into standing forest during the dry season, chopping and setting a match so that what you have at the end of when the fire burns out is a huge pasture to which you can bring heads of cattle, right? Once you can bring heads of cattle, that fits very nicely within the narrative of I've improved this area, I've developed this area, and that's a way in which you can make a claim to the state, to the nation, that this land belongs to me. It was public area, or it was sort of no man's land, now it belongs to me. And so we see that playing out again and again and again. And this past year, deforestation that's related to this kind of land-hungry economic model hit a 20-year high. In response to that, as I've intimated, and I'm going to try to speed up a little bit so we have time for questions, Indigenous people are responding because they want to protect their own lands. They know that the government, even though it's their duty, and there are agencies that are supposed to demarcate and protect land, they're not doing it because of the political situation. And so beginning about a decade ago, Indigenous peoples have stepped into the fray and put their own bodies on the line as frontline defenders of their forested communities, saying, hey, land grabbers can't come here anymore. This is our place. We do exist. The Amazon is not empty land. It's not for the highest bidder. We have rights. We have our communities. We're going to defend them. And so throughout Brazil, you see these red dots. These are areas where this kind of self-defense or auto demarcation, auto meaning self, demarcation meaning drawing a border. These efforts have been pursued by Indigenous peoples throughout Brazil. Now, the Amazon region is here, but you'll note that there's a few instances of auto demarcation, Indigenous people demarcating their own territory where the Brazilian government will not do it, in southern Brazil as well, right? And so again, incredible courage, incredible organization as well to logistically kind of cut a trail through the woods, maintain that trail over time, put up signs, use drones and other kinds of technology to monitor the land. All of these kinds of methods have been experimented with and honed over time by Indigenous people, stepping again into the fray, into the vacuum left by the state's unwillingness to do this work. It's collective work, it's exhausting work, it's work that I've helped with, literally walking along the boundary and using a machete to kind of open it up, put up a sign facing outward saying this is Indigenous land. This is unofficial. Again, the state isn't doing this, but it's done to the official standards. It's done in the way that the state would do it. if the normal process of recognizing those rights were happening. So Indigenous people are very savvy in that way too, of not doing anything that is beyond what is indicated in the 1988 federal Constitution. Again, it's highly coordinated, technical sort of process of defending the forest, demarcating your lands, but then using drones, using GPS equipment, using partnerships with non-governmental organizations within Brazil and others to really make sure that, okay, we've claimed the land, let's tell everybody about it, and let's also, through public relations, through letters, these sorts of things, campaigns, but also let's monitor it so that if we do see somebody, opening up an illegal road into our territory, we can respond. And those are, you can imagine, highly tense happenings, highly tense moments when, you see a new road being opened up or a new patch of deforestation within land that your community has claimed. And you take the boat or you take the four-wheeler out to confront the people who are there. It can be a very tense situation. I should say that in those situations, it's typically an employee of a very wealthy company, very wealthy sort of, agricultural interest that's located in Sao Paulo or in Rio, far away. They have the controlling stake, the company, but their employees tend to be the ones right on that front line. And, the Indigenous people, when they're negotiating with land grabbers, sort of say, we know this isn't you, we don't have any beef with you, but you do need to leave. And, typically the squatters or the colonists then do sometimes come upon a piece of equipment in the demarcated territory that shouldn't be there, and Indigenous people will light it on fire as a way to sort of send the message: this is our land, you're not supposed to be here, and take that message back to your bosses, as it were. But it's incredibly tense, incredibly dangerous, and the stakes are incredibly high for Indigenous leaders. And so this slide represents some of the folks who have put their lives on the line and who have had their lives taken because of their leadership. Ari Uru Ewawao on the left was murdered 2 years ago this month for his defense of territory in southwestern Brazil. On the right, Paulinho Guajajara from the Maranhão region, murdered 3 years ago. And in the middle, a friend of mine from the Munduruku territories, the Tapajós, had her house burned this time last year, just about, when her children were in the house, her 97-year-old great-grandmother was in the house. Everyone got out, but it was an act of terrorism directed at folks who are right there in the front lines, trying to defend territories that the state refuses to do. So finally, to kind of wrap things up, what does this look like from the Indigenous perspective? We know that standing forest managed by Indigenous people is globally important because it's good for the climate, it's good for biodiversity. We know that there are incredible interests aligned against, powerful economic and political interests aligned against Indigenous peoples. Why do they do it though? Why are they standing up? Well, it's because land is essential for Indigenous identity. For Amazonian Indigenous identity, I would make the claim even bigger than that as well. But if we look at Indigenous Amazonians, the particular lands in which you find yourself, that's part of your community. That's part of how you come to know the world. You have relationships with non-human actors, with, of course, your family and your community of humans, but also non-human actors and spirits that are specific to places. And so for the Munduruku can't imagine a world in which they no longer live in and care for and maintain a relationship to place. That's incredibly important, right? Because, and it's at odds maybe with our own thinking of, okay, the Jacksonian idea, the Andrew Jackson idea of, buying land or taking land from Indigenous territory or people and giving them land someplace else, in Oklahoma, for example, in Indian territory. That's tantamount to genocide. It's tantamount to ethnocide. It's tantamount to cutting the connections, the relationships, and the obligations between Indigenous humans and non-humans, animals, plants, spirits, waters, etc. Right? So there's two big principles that I just want to quickly highlight, and we can talk maybe more about them in the question and answer. And they're important because I think they are invitations for non-Indigenous people like me, like perhaps many of you, to rethink how we relate to non-humans. One essential characteristic, one principle of Indigenous claims making or ownership is this principle of reciprocal belonging. And this is the notion that ownership, which is a real thing, ownership, Indigenous people do feel like they own land, but it's not a one-way relationship. Instead, people belong to their land as much as the other way around. People belong to the land, in other words, and the other residents of it, the trees, the birds, etc., can make claims on people. They can oblige people to do certain things. Just like people, right? We're more comfortable with this perhaps. People own land. Well, it's your prerogative what you do with it within the confines of the social contract, right? But we think of the social contract as being between people and their government, or people and other people, not really people and not people. But Indigenous Amazonians see the reciprocity between people and not people, between people and landscapes, between people and animals, as being one of reciprocal belonging. We all belong to one another. We all belong to this place. And the specific place in the Munduruku example, which you see in the image, is a place that it's basically like Jerusalem for the Munduruku. This is the place, an incredibly holy place. Maybe it's Jerusalem and the Garden of Eden rolled into one, because it's the place where the world began, the place where the Creator made the Tapajos River and made humans from pigs, which is important because humans used to be pigs, which means that pigs, wild pigs that you see in the forest, are relatives. And yes, we eat them, but we also see them as being generous in sharing their flesh with us, which demands certain kinds of reciprocal considerations of the pig, and that extends out to other non-game species and to fish species as well. And so the idea of interactivity, the idea of interdependence, the idea that in order for us to continue to survive as humans, we are obliged to do things that non-humans ask of us through ritual expiation, through sacrifice, these sorts of things. This reciprocity becomes the basis of ownership, not, hey, I own the land, the government recognizes I own the land, I can do whatever I want with it, right? That's a very, very key principle for Indigenous ownership. Another related one is the notion of co-creation. So Indigenous people, as they are demarcating land or talking about how the land belongs to us and how we know this land is our land, talk about how humans are obliged to make things with non-humans through processes of co-creation, right? The labor that gets involved in recognizing the creative activities of non-humans, the creative and life-sustaining activities of non-humans. And you have to kind of give space to those activities. You have to try to help cultivate the life-giving and life-affirming activities of fish, of manioc, which I'll say more about in a second. It's based cassava. The variety of non-human actors and humans as well, right? That you have to cultivate in others the ability for them to cultivate you and for them to help you create a shared existence, right? Again, a very different kind of notion than ours, because our notion both of property, but also maybe of subjectivity of reality, is that humans are kind of special and kind of different than non-humans, non-human objects, right? Non-human living things. Humans tend to think of humans as being apart, right? The reasonable animal, endowed with certain kinds of rights and privileges that we do not afford a stone or we don't afford a dog even sometimes, right? But that's our notion. This notion of co-creation recognizes that human thriving depends upon the mutual thriving of non-humans. And where those mutual interests align, there can be some productive co-creation. So the example of cassava or manioc is a key one. This woman here is cultivating, she's digging up the root, which is the staple food for Amazonian peoples, manioc, cassava. And she's doing it in a place that's incredibly rich soil. It's called Terra Preta do Índio, or Indian dark earth. This is land, this is soil that has been cultivated by human activities over thousands of years. And we know that because of archaeology. We know that because if you compare these areas where you find Terra Preta to the majority of Amazonian soils, the fecundity and the productive value of Terra Preta is 100 times more than the productive value of just regular non-cultivated soil that you would see. In fact, it's rather famous that the Amazon's topsoil in general is very poor for agriculture. It's very non-productive. It's very sort of acidic, except where you get these patches of Terra Preta do Índio, which is land that, or areas that over time and over human cultivation of spaces that are felicitous to non-humans, you get more productive soil. Through what? Through composting, through using the land as fallow territories for game animals. It's enriched these areas in ways that the Munduruku and other indigenous people recognize. They recognize that the ancestors have gifted these areas to us. They've allowed these areas to be productive for microbes, for manioc, for game animals, and that we have the responsibility to continue that, to continue to create these areas that will sustain us, but will also sustain the life of other non-humans. So this obligation of co-creation is itself a way of becoming kind of responsible for a place, an owner of a place, and obliged to act on behalf of that place. One of the interesting kind of effects of this this anthropogenic cultivation of soil, which we see throughout the Amazon and on a number of all really of the river tributaries of the Amazon, these archaeologically rich sites that have been cultivated by humans and that are very kind of felicitous to non-human life as well. What we get then is human-induced biodiversity, right? In other words, it's not the case that humans created all the biodiversity of the Amazon, but you can't think of the biodiversity of the Amazon without thinking of how humans have modified the lands in positive ways over the past 10,000 years, how indigenous people have cultivated spaces that are good for non-human species, leading to a supportive and felicitous environment for biodiversity as well. So biodiversity, one of the signal achievements, one of the signal things of this region, is not a story that excludes humans. It's a story that depends upon humans at some degree. What kind of humans? Indigenous Amazonians, right? Not folks who are going to come in and burn it all down and just create a monocrop kind of environment for the production of soy or cattle or whatever it might be, but instead these practices of cultivation that are co-creative, where we are creating something and creating a space where non-humans can create thriving environments as well. Just to illustrate that point about biodiversity and the human support for biodiversity, recent archaeology has revealed that the forest itself has been extensively managed by indigenous people for thousands of years. The place is very diverse. There's something like 200,000 different tree species within the Amazon, but 200 of those species account for 80% of the biomass, which is to say that there's hyperdominance of those particular species. And those particular species, the vast majority of those 200 hyperdominant tree species are useful to humans. They're Brazil nuts, they're cupuaçu fruits, they're acai. So it's not that hard to imagine that the establishment of those 200 species, still a lot of species, but the dominance of those throughout the area is in part due to the propagation of them by humans. Not in a kind of agroforestry regime. We're not talking about, neat and orderly rows of planted trees, but we're talking about humans creating landscapes, creating areas that are felicitous to their own survival and their own thriving, that also have knock-on and beneficial effects for species beyond humans, right? And so we see that with the propagation of trees. We see that with the extent of terra preta, this rich human-made soil throughout the area as well. Okay, so to summarize on what the stakes are for Indigenous people from their perspective, again, trying to think anthropologically about this. Indigenous claims to land are centered on relationships and obligations between communities, among human communities, but also between those humans and the waters, the airs, the non-human species that reside in a specific place. So claims to land are specific to place, and they are not this kind of generic idea that we have in Western legal principles of a human being a subject endowed with certain kinds of special privileges over an object, right? And thereby through those privileges has the right to dispose of that object or use that object how they see fit. That's not the Indigenous system, but the Indigenous system is a system. It is a system with rights, with obligations, where actors are recognized. It has a logic. It has a kind of legal nature to it as well. Actors in those relationships, humans, non-humans, pigs, manioc, microbes, are obliged to act in ways that are mutually beneficial, right? Not all the time, right? Because of course there are moments when the jaguar is hunting and kills a pig. That's not mutually beneficial for that pig, but there are precedent acts, right? Same with humans. Humans are hunting, but there are antecedent acts through which you acknowledge the sacrifice, you honor the sacrifice, you make sure that you are returning the kind of life energy to that area, making sure that the area is good for the jaguar that you might have been hunting or the pig that you might have been hunting, which in turn results, to the points before from archaeology, in a biodiverse and resilient forest, right? The forest is more biodiverse and more resilient because of Indigenous modifications to it, because Indigenous people have been pursuing this theory of ownership, this theory of obligation, this theory of relationship with non-humans. It has strengthened the forest over time. And so that results in the obligations that Indigenous Amazonians, the ways in which they relate to lands and waters and non-humans being really crucial to the reestablishment of a healthy ecosystem. And of course, the 1988 Constitution doesn't say, in Brazil, doesn't say that, okay, if you've been moved away from your lands, you no longer have that right to the land, right? Indigenous people would say, well, of course we still have the right, and we have the obligation to that land. In fact, we want to get back to that land that colonists pushed us off of, because we understand this obligation as being forever, right? This obligation to help restore, this obligation to keep the things that are in balance, right? The relationships between and obligations between humans and non-humans. And so that's what's at stake for Indigenous people. And if we bring it, this is the very last slide, bring it back to kind of the broader considerations and conclusions that I hope we take away from this. Indigenous land tenure is not only a kind of ethnographic exotica that applies or is relevant to Indigenous people in the way that I just kind of outlined. It is, of course, vitally important for the planet, climatologically, hydrologically, biodiversity, et cetera, right? Not just from the Amazon's perspective, but in other Indigenous territorial contexts as well. But in Brazil, and when we're connected to this in some way, because it's a global economy, the United States imports some products from Brazil, doesn't really import too many agricultural products. One thing that Americans are doing that is maybe supporting the destruction of the Amazon is, oddly enough, through investments, through pension funds, through these kinds of things that have seen investing in Brazilian agriculture as being a net positive for returns. So in that way, we're kind of benefiting from things that are happening. But if we zoom in, we see, especially from the indigenous perspective, genocidal efforts to convert lands into private property. Again, much in the same way that, or using some of the same ideas, some of the same ideology of American manifest destiny. The idea that, well, this is our future. It's too much land for too few Indians. Let's make a quick profit, right? The whole political and economic system has a kind of racial animus built into it. But despite all that, indigenous people are not lying down and taking it. They are at the front lines of defending their own territory for the reasons we just discussed, because there's mutual obligations to do that. But also they understand the global importance of what they're doing. And to return to the title of this talk and a line from my friend Alessandra, it's for all of us that they're stepping into this breach, because we all benefit from standing forest. We all benefit immensely, even if we're not conscious of it, from indigenous management of land in the Amazon and beyond. So those are some of the thoughts I hope we can maybe unpack a little bit further. I just want to thank you again. We have 15 minutes or so for conversation. Thank you everyone for being here. And thanks again, Ollie, for the invitation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. Take a look at the chat.
Yes, there are a couple questions in the chat, and I'm now going to allow people to unmute themselves. I turned that function off. Excellent.
Thank you, Meg. So Louise has a great question. I'll read it out loud and then respond to it. She says, you mentioned that the government of Brazil is not interested in preserving the Amazon. Is this money-based? Is this money-based or corruption-based? It would seem that it is in their benefit to preserve this area. Yes, it's some and some, Louise. Certainly the as I mentioned, the political and economic model in Brazil is very extensive, which is to say it's land hungry. It's been kind of predicated on the idea that land is cheap and that it can be acquired cheaply from a capital perspective, right? And then be made to produce profits, right? And so that's been kind of the guiding principle. But there's also a ton of corruption bound up in that. Again, you come back to the statistic that I shared, that so much wealth is controlled by relatively few people. That system depends on corruption. I mean, we might from the outside just think, okay, that's a little untoward. It's not very fair, and that's true. I would agree with that. But it also, you don't get to that level of concentration without the incentives being, okay, if you're wealthy and want to maintain your wealth in this kind of system or grow it, one of the cheapest ways to do so is to buy a politician, right? Or to work several levers of corruption so that the law can appear to be democratically arrived at, or a policy can appear to be in the best interest of the nation, but it's really in my sector's or my family's best interest. And so I would say that the political question is always, and the economic question is always also about corruption in the Brazilian context. To your point about it being in the economic best interest of Brazil to preserve the Amazon over the long haul, I couldn't agree more. But here again, I think we're in the same boat that many of us find ourselves in when we think about the climate crisis, right? Spending, it's very clear, the economic and the scientific analysis is very clear that if we spend money on converting our energy system right now, yeah, it's going to cost a little bit up front. It's going to cost more than it does right now for us to fill up our pump, even though, or fill up at the pump, even though we're all feeling higher gas prices right now. But it is true that like to go fully solar or go fully renewable would require a down payment. However, that down payment, the cost of that down payment, if we have to do it eventually anyway, goes up and up and up the longer we wait, right? So it becomes more expensive to make the improvements to our economy next year or 10 years from now or 30 years from now than it would be to do it now. But a lot of people can't conceptualize 20 or 30 years from now. It isn't politically expedient to do so. And so we go with the status quo, right? And I think a lot of that is resonating. That resonates here at home, but a lot of that also helps explain the situation in Brazil, where it's clear that if the Amazon disappears, Brazilian agriculture is going to suffer. And Brazilian agriculture is where all the money is, where all the influence is. But the longer term kind of vision is not, it hasn't won the day. That argument hasn't won the day. But our climatological friends have been putting that forward, like, hey, you might not like indigenous rights, but this is a dollars and cents argument. In 30 years' time, if we continue at this rate, your crop yields will fall off a cliff because there won't be any rainfall in southern Brazil anymore. Does that worry you, big agro? Of course it worries them, but there hasn't been a political or even an economic kind of response to that yet. Okay, thank you, Louise. Susan, how does Brazil's current government figure into all this? How do we convince people to forego short-term gain to save our Earth long-term? Fabulous question. I just sort of danced around that a little bit in the response to Louise's question. I think here we can learn from our indigenous partners too. Many of us in the West, or many of us in sort of the global North, are feeling or becoming familiar with climate anxiety, environmental induced anxiety, right? The kinds of psychological dimensions and outcomes of feeling like things are unpredictable politically, environmentally, et cetera. What do we do with that? It can feel very kind of disarming and deadening inside almost to deal with climate anxiety. I think it might be worthwhile, though, kind of pivoting for a second and saying for 500 years, indigenous peoples throughout North and South America have dealt with the existential crisis of capitalism, colonialism, environmental destruction, right? And have, proven their resilience, through community, through family, through insisting on the contemporaneous or the modern, I should say, viability of their lifeways, right? And have adapted to circumstances and have even in some situations thrived. And so convincing people, to get back to Susan's question, convincing people to forego short-term gain to save our Earth requires a bit of that too, right? It requires a kind of, okay, right now things, you can choose, right? You either ignore the climate situation and just spend freely and consume freely and say, not my problem. Or you can get really concerned about it. Like, we can't do anything about it. What are we going to do? There might be other ways, though, again, based on the inspiration of the thriving and surviving and adaptation of a number of communities throughout the world. We should be taking our cues from them. I think we really should, just like the World Conservation Congress did back in September, taking cues from indigenous leadership and sort of kind of figuring out how we can learn from them, but also how we can support them, I think would be an incredible step in the direction of, looking past short-term gain to see the bigger picture. All right. Judy asks, is the survival of indigenous people sustainable on the land for the long term? How can the government or NGOs support them for protecting the land and the planet? Great questions. Yes, indigenous people can, if left alone, or if left to make their own choices, maybe that's the better way to say it, can certainly sustain themselves, can sustain the land, and can even, I would go so far as to say, can sustain relationships with non-indigenous people that they enter into through their own choice. The Munduruku people with whom I work are very interested in developing production chains that are sustainable and that are based in the extraction of non-timber forest products that have a value and that they would love to be able to sell. And some of them are actually doing it, selling to non-indigenous people in return for cash, right? Indigenous people in Brazil, and I would say throughout the world, don't want to, for the most part, not be part of the contemporary world. They certainly do want to be part of the contemporary world. Alessandra, the person who I quoted at the very beginning, is in law school right now and training to be a lawyer. She's also a chief in her indigenous village, right? So indigenous people have a lot of practice in living in multiple worlds, right? And living in at least two worlds. And so I think the key thing is to afford them as much control and decision-making capability as possible, right? And that can happen through partnerships, that can happen through governments simply doing what governments say they are going to do, recognizing and enforcing the rights that are already there. So unfortunately, though, we have the economic problem. We also have deeply held racist ideas about Indigenous people in the Brazilian context, certainly in the US context, we see that as well, that get in the way, that take a lot of air out of the room, right? Because Indigenous people are always kind of having to answer the accusation that they aren't real, or that they're, that they're not who they say they are. That's very common in Brazil. It's a little bit different here, perhaps, but you get the kind of thing that I'm saying, right? That's takes more energy to respond to those kinds of things, and can get us off the hey, but how do we need to support people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who are going to care for the earth? And the answer is yes, we can do it. It just takes that commitment, right? Fred has two questions. One, what organizations can we donate to that help support Indigenous ownership of the Amazon? Great question, Fred. I have a lot of ideas. Certainly, there are some big name organizations based in the global north. Conservation International comes to mind. Greenpeace comes to mind as organizations that have a growing and strong track record of working with frontline communities to support their efforts to hold their territories. That said, one of the great things about the internet age is that you can actually donate directly to frontline organizations across borders and across currencies. So COICA, the umbrella organization of Indigenous communities that I mentioned, Gregorio Mirabal is the executive director of it. You can support them. You can support another organization that's similar, but only based in Brazil, in the Brazilian Amazon, called COIABI. They actually are putting on a mass protest in Brasilia this week, and they have on their homepage they have a donate button. So, and I'm sure they would take your donations with a lot of grace and gratitude. So yeah, I would say over the past 5 years, the global conservation community, so Conservation International, World Wildlife Fund for Nature, TNC, the Nature Conservancy, have really fully embraced Indigenous leadership and Indigenous agenda items in their global action. So any of those that you maybe already are familiar with or already support, your funds are going to support that good work. And then there are, closer to the frontline communities the organizations that I could point out as well. Your second question, Fred, is one that I've been working on for the past several years. And it's been a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back as far as how to influence pension funds when it comes to their support for Amazonian agricultural development. Finding out if your fund does so is half the battle, and it can be difficult. If you hold anything in BlackRock, you certainly, BlackRock, we know for a fact, has invested in dodgy funds, dodgy agricultural funds that are contributing directly to deforestation in the Amazon. Other ones, big names like TIAA, where I have some retirement investments, it's a little bit more difficult because TIAA, has divulged as a result of investigations that they have invested in some areas in the northeast of Brazil. So this isn't the Amazon. And they have a special program whereby they prove the title to the land so that they cannot be accused of having contributed to land grabbing or the dispossession of Afro-Brazilian communities or Indigenous communities. But from my professional perspective, they haven't done enough to assure that's the case. And that's because it's somewhat impossible to, in the Brazilian context, really prove up that the land that you're investing in hasn't been part of the dispossession from a marginalized community, right? And so my recommendation to TIAA that I've made, and I would make it to any investment body, is do not invest in Brazilian agricultural companies or directly in land, which is what BlackRock's done both. TIAA has just done directly in land, and they claim that the land is kind of clear and free of the kinds of disputes that I've outlined in this talk, but they really don't have the basis from which to say that. And so it really needs to be elevated and pressed by shareholders that, that one, divesting from anything that could even be by association found to be contributing to Amazonian deforestation, but then also investing in reforestation schemes, in carbon neutrality schemes, those kinds of business ventures, which are starting to pop up in South America as well, would be kind of the next step that I would recommend folks pursue. So thanks for those questions, Fred. George, you said that where Indigenous tenure of land is assured, the forest is healthy. To what extent is this due to a low Indigenous population to land ratio? I think that's a good point, George. Yeah, so it is true that in general, although there are plenty of good exceptions to this, if you look at the global sort of context, in general, Indigenous territories have low population densities. And where there are low human population densities, it's, it carries, it follows that the impact on that land is relatively low, right? Especially when you're talking about populations that, are relatively light on the land in terms of there's no industrial installations or things of this nature, right? I would say though that that's only maybe the tip of the iceberg, right? Because we could have similar sorts of people to land kind of ratios being incredibly non-sustainable. If you look at the heartland of our country, look at areas of Nebraska, where there might be contained animal feedlot operations, right? Very few people, but our economic and political system that is part of the broader country, right, is incredibly intensive and polluting and damaging in that particular place, right? And so I would just caution us from doing any quick math to look at sort of human population density as being the key to environmental sustainability, because I think that could lead us down the road of saying, well, 8 billion people is too many on our planet. And, we can debate that. and the demographers certainly say we're about to plateau at about 11 billion. There's enough room though for people. It just depends on how we utilize that, and kind of the economic and political choices that we make as a collective. Let's see, Suzanne, does Brazil look to sub-Saharan Africa and worry they could be going in that direction if Amazonia is destroyed? Yes. Well, I should say many of us are worried about that. I included myself as a non-Brazilian, but someone who spent a lot of time there as being part of Brazil. And so the Brazilian academic establishment is certainly concerned about this. Some people sort of in the Green Party establishment in Brazil are worried about that. But it's not a dominant theme in political conversations in Brazil. Instead, it's, what's dominating the headlines in Brazil right now is inflation, it's unemployment, it's what are you going to do for me now? What are you going to do for me lately? And there, the kind of longer term kind of horizon of, the southeast of our country might be turned into a desert because the north of our country might become a grassland. Scientists are shouting about this, but unfortunately, policymakers and journalists, are relatively mute on the subject.
Okay, we're at time, but I want to thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm sure that you've seen some of the thank yous that have come up in the chat, but thank you again. And I'm going to go ahead and end this now for everyone. So
perfect. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Meg.
Excellent discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everyone.